Story 1. This happened 3 years ago, but my friend reminded me of it yesterday, so I thought I'd share. It was the middle of June, and my first weekend off in quite a long time. I'd been giving my friend a never-ending rain check of promising to teach her to fish. Our schedules finally lined up, the weather was perfect, and it was fishing time. We arrived at a local lake. It's the type where you don't need a fishing license, just a pass for the lake. The money goes to the city. We bought our passes from the concession stand and headed back to my car to get the gear. I brought 3 setups, one for me, one for a friend, and one just in case. It was a really busy Saturday morning with lots of people. We did a mini hike across the lake to get to our spot and started fishing. My friend learned quickly. We caught a few fish before the sun was all the way up. We were excited about how well the day was going and decided to take a lunch break when it started to get hot. At about 11, we took the stuff back to my car, chilled, ate, hydrated, and headed back. While we were walking back, a group of kids broke away from their families to follow us around. They were all boys, 4 of them, 3 of whom were probably around 8 to 11 years old, and the 4th was maybe 6. I thought they just wanted to watch us fish and likely told their parents where they were going, so I didn't even think about it. We got back to our spot, but the kids were trying to follow us down the hill. The top of the hill had a trail. If you were careful, you could climb down to reach a small landing close to the water's edge. It was stressing me out to watch these kids try to climb down, so I yelled up to them about a safer place for them to watch, basically next to us, easier to get to, but with a gap between the landings. Once they got down, they decided to have a rock skipping contest, which wasn't exactly polite to do next to people fishing, but I let it go. Then these kids decided to have a jumping contest. They were jumping from their landing to our landing back and forth. There was only a 2-foot gap, but if they fell, they'd definitely get hurt. My friend was getting more stressed than me watching them and made them promise her to be careful. They said what I probably would have said when I was their age. Fine. Whatever, guys. The ringleader of the group, the oldest, maybe 11, then asked me if they were allowed to fish. I asked them if they had a pass, silly me, and they said yes in unison. I told them, if you get a pass, you're good to go. The ringleader put his hands on my fishing pole that I was holding still and asked if he could use it. I pulled away and said, "No, bud, I'm using it." He picked up my just-in-case pole without asking and said, "What about this one?" I replied, "No, that's mine, and I don't want you hurting yourself with it." The little troublemaker gave me an attitude and shouted, "Well, what can I use?" I didn't even know what to say at first, but I pulled out Old Faithful. "Go ask your parents." It worked. They immediately left. About 20 minutes later, we heard a large group of people coming down the trail. It was the kids and their family, and the kids were whispering and pointing at me, mostly just the ringleader. A woman a bit older than me, guessing she was the mom, angrily made her way over to the spot and laid into me. I don't remember everything, but the general consensus was that I was ungrateful and I needed to get hurt, her words. The kids were still close, so I decided to keep it family friendly. I also have a little issue with my hearing. If something is too loud, I can't usually make out the sound. Like, if you're yelling at me, I'm not going to get every word. I explained I couldn't hear her when she raised her voice. She started yelling louder. I was getting nothing, and my friend was mortified. I stared at her until there was a break and said, "Yeah, I didn't get a word of that." She almost started to go off again when the husband, boyfriend, or older brother shouted something at her in another language, and she stopped. The angry lady asked, "Did you tell these boys they couldn't fish?" I replied, "No, I said just the opposite." She was stunned. "Why can't they fish then? They're allowed to fish at this lake." "They can fish. They're absolutely allowed to fish here. They just can't use my stuff." "Why not? Everyone else here is fishing. This lake is owned by the city." "Yep, sure is." There were blank stares for way too long. "You need to teach them to fish." "Miss, I can't watch all of them." "What if they hurt themselves?" "Yes, you are. My taxes pay your salary." "No, they do not." "Yes, they do. I pay taxes, and taxes pay for this lake. And they better not hurt themselves, because if they do." "You think I work here?" More blank stares. "Miss, I work at place I used to work, doing thing I did while I was there." Even more blank stares. I fix computers. I didn't, but it's easier to say that than explain what I really did. Silence. This poor lady looked so embarrassed as it clicked that I was just a person fishing on their day off. But I didn't even get an apology. No recognition that she was wrong. She just climbed back over to the rest of the family as they quietly spoke amongst themselves, walking away in their shame. When they were finally out of sight, my friend and I gave each other the "what the heck just happened" look and broke into the most beautiful 45-minute session of uncontrollable laughter I've ever had. Story 2. This was years ago. My husband was in the army on his second enlistment, 5 or 6 years total at this point. He'd already been through a couple of deployments by this point. We were at a new base overseas, and I'd gotten a job at the after-school care facility on post. Well, his unit was getting ready to deploy for 6 months, so they were in the thick of all that. The chaplain was having a pre-deployment meeting for all the spouses to talk about the changes to expect while our spouses are deployed, from practical issues to emotional stuff to disruptions in routine. Bear in mind this was back when, if you were really lucky, you maybe got a 10-minute call from your spouse once a month. Maybe an email as well. Letters were still more common than anything. Now, both my husband and I are pretty easygoing, and we'd both been through a couple of deployments, so I already knew the drill, what to expect, and how to manage. So I decided not to bother with a meeting. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a fantastic resource for spouses, and they would do a post-deployment one as well to help everyone transition back to normal life with their spouses, but I didn't feel the need to attend. A couple of days later, my husband showed up at my workplace and told me he'd been ordered by his lieutenant to bring me to the spouse meeting. This was a second lieutenant who was fresh out of officer candidate school, was not prior enlisted, and my husband had socks older than this guy's term of military service. For those who don't know, a second lieutenant is the lowest ranked officer. They're the newcomers, and it's very common for them to think they know it all and act accordingly. This guy was one of those. I was highly peeved, but not for one moment did I blame my husband. I could tell he was annoyed as well, and I knew that since it was a direct order, he had to obey it. I thought for a minute and asked him to hang on a minute so I could talk to my boss. Now, school was set to let out soon, and they needed me there because of adult-child ratio requirements, but I explained the situation to my boss and told her I'd be back as soon as possible. She understood the situation and said she'd fill in for me until I could get back. She was cool that way, and everyone on base, if they weren't military, was the spouse of one due to being on an overseas base, so they all knew and understood when stuff like this came up. Very rarely, you'd get the random general schedule employee civilian on post, but yeah, that was highly unusual. So I left with my husband, but instead of going to the chaplain's meeting, I told him to take me to his building where the second lieutenant was. He knew what I was up to and happily complied. I arrived at the lieutenant's office, knocked, and went in while my husband stood in the hall. I asked him why he had ordered my husband to fetch me from my job that I was needed at. He rather pompously mansplained to me that this was a required function and that I needed to attend. Oh, I let him have it. I didn't raise my voice much, but I informed him in no uncertain terms that he had no authority whatsoever to order me to do anything. I was not in the military, not subject to his whims, and while he may be able to order my husband to come get me, he could not order me to go to this meeting. He tried interjecting at this point to say that I needed to go so that I would learn stuff about how to handle my husband being on a deployment. At this point, I nearly blew my top. I spent more time with my husband being in the field and on deployments than you've spent in the military. My husband does not own me. He cannot force me to do anything, and neither can you. I will not be attending this meeting, and you will not force my husband to take me there. I am going back to my job, and if I hear that you tried to make his life miserable because of it, so help me, I will go up your chain of command and make sure you regret it. Now, the building was not full, but it wasn't quite empty either. Oh, and the higher-ups were in their offices pretty close by. They were also super cool cats. My husband might have been enlisted, but they respected the work he did, and he respected them. And this lieutenant had been getting on their nerves as well. So yeah, they absolutely could hear what was going on, and I'm sure they enjoyed it. By the end of my tirade, the second lieutenant was nearly falling over himself to apologize. Sorry, ma'am, I apologize. Ma'am, it won't happen again, ma'am. He knew he was in the wrong, and by this point, he also knew I'd make a right royal stink if he tried to make me do anything or tried to punish my husband for my actions or lack thereof. I left, and my husband took me back to my job, grinning like a fool. I was still pretty enraged at this point, but was cooling off pretty rapidly. For a few weeks afterward, I actually was concerned that there might be fallout for my husband because of what I did, but there wasn't. At least, not more than the usual nonsense he dealt with on a daily basis. It was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Like I said, I'm pretty laid back normally, but I will get steamed on other people's behalf. The problem is that I almost never have the opportunity or the right to get involved, and I recognize that sometimes doing so would definitely make it worse. So having this opportunity was just golden. Story 3. Hey, y'all. Big fan here. Posted some stories and tales from retail, but it's my first time here. I'll try to keep it short. I worked in a furniture plant, building and supervising, making not much more than minimum wage, with very few benefit, between 13 years ago. The last year I was there was some kind of hostile takeover involving the various owners that I never fully understood and wouldn't care to. Suddenly, there was a new boss. That very busy fall, boss brings in about a dozen Latino Spanish speakers. I don't know their statuses, don't care, and tells us they're temps to help us through the rush. Not much of a problem, just a bit of extra work getting them up to speed alongside us, you know? I spoke and understood enough Spanish to make small talk, dirty jokes, and make myself look foolish. Not all of them spoke English, but enough did to help me get points across. I pretty much ran to the cabinet room then. I worked with a dude I'll call Bob. Not his name, he was Mexican. I'm just not trying to sound insensitive here by assigning him a random Latino name. Anyway, I spent several weeks working with Bob and others, showing them the ropes, teaching, training, etc. Nothing I hadn't done before, just on a larger scale. But mostly, I worked with Bob, supposedly so boss could open a second shift to keep up with the volume. 6 weeks later, I found out differently. The hard way. Boss lays off all the old crew, permanently, and keeps on the so-called temps at a significantly lower rate, like 2/3 of what my crew and I were making. We just spent a month and a half training our replacements. Yes, I know it's probably illegal. No, I didn't know it then. My last day, Bob came to me, tears streaming down his face. He just realized what happened. He's practically sobbing, saying he's taking money out of my pocket, food off my table, and he can't live with it. Mind you, I'd gotten to know him a bit by then. I really liked this guy. This man was a legal resident, trying to become a citizen the right way. So I won't hear a word now from anyone about people taking jobs, etc. Let's keep the politics out of this, please. If I'm crossing the line here, I apologize. Bottom line is, he was distraught. I told him it was nothing personal. He didn't know. He was just trying to feed his family too. We embraced, like men who'd fought a war together, and that was that. Long story short, I spent the next 18 months or so unemployed, as a stay-at-home dad, rearing an infant son and toddler daughter, and feverishly writing a book I'd been trying to finish for years. Meanwhile, my wife X now worked full-time, and we barely kept our heads above water. We wouldn't have if not for family. Fast forward about 9-10 months after the layoff, and here comes the I don't work here lady moment. I'm in the backyard, mowing, and I get this sudden, excruciating pain in my lower back. I hobbled inside, fighting back tears and nausea, and laid down on the couch, thinking maybe I just twisted something. But it's absolute agony. My mother-in-law was there at the time. She's convinced I'm having a heart attack. I was 30-ish at the time, but severely overweight, so, yeah, maybe? She calls for an ambulance while I'm writhing on the couch, trying to protest that I'm okay. In the middle of this fiasco, I get a call from my former employer. It's the secretary. She says boss wants to know if I'd be interested in an installation job, 2 states away, involving things that furniture companies never did. And how soon could I get there? I laughed hard, causing me no amount of further agony. Secretary, hello? Me. Yeah, I'll get right on that. Secretary, really? Oh, that's great. We haven't. Me, sure. Just tell him I'll do it for $25 per hour, plus full benefits, with a written contract for no less than the next 3 years. Secretary, I didn't think he's gonna go for that. Me, yeah, right. Lady, you just tell that double-crossing piece of work that is the current price of my dignity. I don't normally talk to anyone this way, let alone women, but she was in on it from the start. P.S. The pain turned out to be a kidney stone. Also, I ran into Boss a couple of years later with his unpleasant girlfriend at the local home improvement store, and he actually had the nerve to try to shake my hand. Luckily for him, the friends with me were able to hold me back. People like that are not worth the jail time,